Much ado, let me pass on the virtual stage to Damian Pfeiffer from the Cleveland Fed, who will be today's moderator. Damian?
Thank you, Rafael. The topics of today's sessions are inflation disagreement weakens the power of monetary policy and nonlinear inflation dynamics in many cost economies. Special thanks, as usual, to the organizer, Rafael Schoenle from Brandeis University and SIBRA, and Dominic Smith from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Let's talk a little bit about the format. The webinar is 45 minutes, 2 presentations, each presentation approximately 15 minutes, and then a Q&A session at the end for about 10 to 15 minutes. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio or video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, pose their questions during the presentations already and do not have to wait until the end. The moderator will then select questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar, which is after the presentations. The webinar is also live streamed via the SIBRA YouTube channel, recorded and made available at the SIBRA website and SIBRA YouTube channel after the event. Before we start, the disclaimer: participation in a SIBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a SIBRA or SIBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of SIBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. Let me introduce the speakers. The first speaker today will be Zheng Liu, who's a Vice President, International Research, and Director of the Center of the Pacific Basin Studies at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. He will talk today about inflation disagreement weakens the power of monetary policy. And the second speaker is Andres Blanco, who's a research economist and associate advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He will talk about nonlinear inflation dynamics in many cost economies. Let's start. Zheng, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Damian. Thank you, Rafael and Dominic, for organizing this. Let me share screen. If, Damian, you can stop sharing. Okay. Do you see my screen now? All right. Thank you for setting up this webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity to present my recent work on inflation disagreement. It's a co-author with Ding Dong, Pengfei Wan, and Ming Wei. And normally we think about monetary policy. Policy pays a lot of attention to inflation expectations. And normally the expectations are measured by the median or mean expectations from surveys, like this black line in this figure in the middle. And we sometimes talk about the distribution of the expectations, like the interquartile range, but that's rare. Mostly the Fed and policymakers are thinking about the median. But in the data, there is a lot of movements in the whole distribution of inflation expectations. As you can see in this figure, the top red line indicates the 75th percentile expectation, and the blue indicates the 25th. There's a substantial gap, and also the gap varies. Here's a scatter, the cross-sectional, like a snapshot of the range of inflation forecasts from Michigan Survey, Consumer Survey, the 1-year ahead forecast on the left. The distribution goes from below 0, it's truncated here, to above 20%. This is in June 2023. And on the right is a figure showing the distribution of a consumer's perception about the Fed's inflation target. The data is from a special module of New York Fed Survey of Consumer Expectations. And thanks to Damian for sharing this data. So again, this figure shows that consumers, even despite our communication that the target is 2%, consumers don't really know or don't pay attention. The range of perception ranges from 0 to over 8%. And this disagreement measured by IQR, the interquartile range of the expectations, vary both for the short horizon forecast, 1 year, the black line here, or longer run inflation forecast. As you can see in this figure, in recent years, the IQR just shot up while the actual inflation was up. So what does this mean for monetary policy? People don't agree all the time about the inflation going forward. The goal of this paper is to examine how does inflation disagreement affect monetary policy transmission. This is an empirical question. We look at the transmission for both a conventional policy through Fed funds rate shock or unconventional policy through forward guidance shock. And the second question we try to address in the paper, but I won't have much time to go through the details, is the theoretical channels through which inflation disagreement could affect monetary policy transmission. I'll just summarize the main channel later. So let's dive in. To study how inflation disagreement affect monetary policy transmission, we just estimate a local projections specification along the line of Oscar Jorda. On the left side, it's the cumulative growth of the variable of interest. Here we focus on two variables, one at a time. One is the consumption expenditure. The other is the PCE inflation. So it's a change from the pre-shock period, T-1, to age period after the shock. And the shock is MP. MP could be the federal funds rate or the forward guidance shock. These are the monetary policy surprises constructed by Eric Swanson, and we orthogonalize the surprises by some publicly available information prior to the policy announcements. And the key variable of interest is the IQR pi. With the superscript pi, it denotes the IQR of the inflation expectation 1 year ahead, scaled by the median expectation. Why do we scale? Because in periods with high median expectations, 1%, say the 75th quartile is 1% higher and the 25th is 1% lower. It would be very different in the situation where the median is 10% versus the median is 2%. So the gap would be, it's like IQR in that case would be 2 percentage points, but in the case with low inflation, it's a huge change. So we want to normalize by the median. And we include a bunch of macro controls, select variables of consumption, industrial production, unemployment inflation, and shadow Fed funds rate. So the key parameters are alpha 1 and alpha 3. Alpha 1 captures the effect of the policy absent any disagreement. So when the IQR pi is not there. Alpha 3 captures the additional effect from the policy when there is an increase in disagreement. So if alpha 3 has the opposite sign as alpha 1, then we would say an increase in IQR or disagreement would attenuate the effects of a policy shock. Indeed, we find that an increase in disagreement attenuates the policy shock for both Fed funds rate shock on the bottom row and the forward guidance shock on the top row. The two columns are the consumption expenditure and the PCE price index, respectively. So as you can see, the black line is the point estimate of the impulse responses of these variables to each shock. So focus on the top left panel. you can see there's a significant decline in PCE. I don't show the error bands. Those dashed lines are the high disagreement response versus low disagreement response. The red is a high disagreement. It's 1 standard deviation increase in the inflation disagreement. What's the alpha 3? Alpha 3 times that standard deviation, and then plus alpha 1, which is a black line. So it's like when IQR pi is higher, what would be the response to the shock? And you can see in all 4 panels, you can see the red dashed line is above the black, meaning that the recessionary effect of the tightening, either through FG shock or FFR shock, would be smaller when inflation disagreement is higher. And the magnitude is about 1/3 smaller, so it's quite substantial. In the paper, we do show the original impulse responses with error bands. They're all statistically significant as well. So what's driving this effect? This figure shows that on top of the disagreement is actually the upper skewness of the expectations. It adds to the attenuation effect. This alpha 5 is the skewness interactive with monetary policy. Alpha 3 is still the IQR interactive with policy. You can see the IQR attenuates recessionary effects, and the skewness further attenuates on top of the IQR. And then, of course, this disagreement can be endogenous to the shock and to other things. Maybe there's omitted variable bias. So this regression look at the state level data. We have 50 states from New York Fed survey of consumer expectations. So we construct the IQR for disagreement for each state, for each period, starting from 2013. And this alpha 3 captures the effect of the same monetary policy shock for all states, MP. For those states that with a high inflation disagreement, what would be the effect of the monetary policy shock on, say, the state's unemployment rate? If alpha 3 is negative, that means there's a smaller effect of the contractionary shock because the shock would raise unemployment. Now, alpha 3 is negative, it would bring it down or raise it less. For forward guidance shock and for FFR shock, in both cases, alpha 3 is negative and significant. So in states with a high disagreement, monetary policy contraction has a smaller recessionary effect. So there's attenuation. And further, because inflation expectation is, you cannot think of as exogenous because people's expectation depend on their demographics, their sensitivity to shocks, and so on. So we look at inflation expectation based on life experience. This data set is constructed by Nagel in his new working paper, and also similar data used by Melman-Deer and Nagel in their earlier paper. With life experience-based expectations, it's hard to argue that that kind of expectation is endogenous, because it's like when you are older, you lived through the 70s high inflation, you would just think any change in price, you're very sensitive. You think inflation will come back. But if you never lived through that experience, you probably don't think that way. So we do the same. This is age cohort-based expectation. We just construct the IQR and normalize by median, construct a disagreement measure, and do the same regression as a baseline. You see alpha 1 is negative, that's a consumption, but alpha 3 is positive, meaning that the disagreement using this experience-based expectation attenuates the policy. So here's a bunch of robustness in the paper if you're interested. Just briefly go through the economic mechanism. So the evidence suggests that high inflation disagreement, and in particular skewness of beliefs, would attenuate the power of monetary policy shock. And we find that these observations can be rationalized in a model with heterogeneous beliefs and occasionally binding credit constraints. You can just imagine a world where households, the Fed says there's a 2% inflation target. The household do not completely believe the same way. Some, like a little like the New York Fed chart. Some households think the target will be higher, some think it will be lower than 2%. Those households with believe that inflation will be higher will perceive a lower real rate because the Fed funds rate, everybody sees that. And then if they think the real rate is low, the household would consume more. They have high MPC, and they would like to borrow to consume subject to borrowing constraint. So households with very high expectation of inflation would borrow to the limit. They become constraint agent and they cannot spend any more than that borrowing limit allow them. So when disagreement goes up, there's a larger set of constraint agents, then consumption, aggregate consumption will be determined more by these constraint agents. It would respond less to the policy shocks. Through the Phillips curve, inflation would respond less to the policy shock too. And the skewness, obviously, through the borrowing constraint, the skewness drives is also important. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this. There's some evidence supporting the connection between the inflation expectation and the consumption spending. Using information treatment, they can tease out households with higher inflation expectation tend to spend more. And there are some other cross-country studies too. And let me just end with this table. Basically, the model also implies that borrowing constraint is important. People with a high inflation expectation are more likely to exhaust their borrowing capacity. So this is, again, taking data from the survey of consumer expectations. So we are correlating the willingness spending, the perceived credit access condition with the individual's expected inflation 1 year ahead. So these correlations, the first row, are all significantly positive, suggesting that individuals with high inflation expectations are not only express high willingness to spend, but also perceive the credit access, both current period and next 12 months, would be harder. So the meaning that they are probably fitting the borrowing constraint as binding. So in conclusion, we document evidence that inflation disagreement weakens the effects of monetary policy. And we present a simple theoretical model with heterogeneous beliefs and borrowing constraints that can rationalize this empirical finding. So for policy implication, the model basically, and our evidence suggests that the reason why, despite the very aggressive Fed tightening in the past few years, retail sales consumption remains resilient, unemployment remains low, inflation remains stubbornly high. It's because that was a period with high disagreement. So the tightening policy is less effective than usual. Going forward, if the disagreement of inflation remains high, then to cushion the slowdown in the economy, the Fed probably need to pursue more aggressive easing. I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Andres.
Now, can you listen?
We hear you. Yes, we still don't see you, the slides, but yes.
Perfect. So this is showing work with Corina, Callum, and Virgilio. So let me start. So one of the main facts that we have is during periods of high inflation, there is an increase in the fraction of price changes. So in principle, the Phillips curve is nonlinear. In this project, we want to study this question, and one of the main microfoundations of time moving frequency are menu cost models, where the firm chooses optimally when to change the price, subject to a cost. In the first step, we're going to take a standard menu cost model, and we're going to show that it predicts a linear Phillips curve. When this model is consistent with the distribution of price changes for the level of inflation increase that we see in advanced economies. And what is the main reason for this result?
Andres, are you intending to show us slides right now?
Oh, yes.
Yes, we can't see them.
Ah. Now,
Now we can. Thank you.
sorry about that. So let me continue. So when you take a standard menu cost model, these models have a hard time to reproduce the increase in the frequency follow for moderate inflation rate. So in this model, the slope of the Philip curve is linear. Now, when you go and you see why inflation is the low elasticity of inflation to real marginal cost, we tend to think that this is mainly because of sticky prices. Now, in practice, the main reason why we have flat slope of Philip curve is because we have strategic complementarities. What the strategic complementarity means is that when I change my price, I tend to follow the price of my network. So we find that this result tend to be amplified with strategic complementarities. So how we're going to extend a menu cost model in order to generate the elasticity of the frequency to shocks. Basically, we're going to take a multi-product menu cost model studied by Rafael, Virgilio, Fernando, and company, and we're going to add two ingredients. Ingredient number one, we're going to add strategic complementarities at the firm and no product level. Whenever the prices across products are more dispersed relative to the average price of the firm, this is going to generate low flow penalty in the profit at the firm level. Second, we're going to add a low elasticity substitution between products of a firm. Think about I go to Starbucks and I have a LMTS production function between coffee and croissant. With these two assumptions, the model implies less within firm misallocation from inefficient price dispersion. So the firm will choose optimally. So the model will need a smaller menu cost to reproduce the distribution of price changes. Basically, what we're going to do is to generate the smallest bands, and we can still reproduce the dispersion of price changes. So when we go and we study how our model responds to monetary shocks, we're going to find that the model generates no linear Philip curve in contrast to the standard menu cost, because we can generate a strong response in the frequency following a monetary shock. So let me start with a motivating fact. Remember the following. Basically, inflation can always be decomposed in extensive and intensive margin. And Clino and Christoph in 2005, they did this composition, and they found that inflation is mainly driven by intensive margin. That is, not for how many prices are changing, but condition for price change, the size. We're going to repeat this exercise, but instead of taking aggregate inflation with sectors. And why? Because aggregate inflation before 2021 used to be stable, but sectoral inflation, there is a lot of movements. So we're going to decompose sectoral inflation in the extensive and intensive margin. By accounting, inflation can be decomposed in the average size of price change, condition of adjustment, times the number of the fraction of price changes given by F. Now, how we're going to isolate the intensive margin? We're going to compute the counterfactual inflation where the intensive margin is moving by the frequency stay constant. Here in this graph, in the x-axis, we're going to have annualized sectoral inflation and deviation from the mean. That's why you see the zero. And on the y-axis, we see the counterfactual sector inflation, where the only thing that moves is the size of price changes. What you can see here, when inflation is close to the mean in any sector, most of the inflation tends to be driven by the intensive margin. That's why the counterfactual inflation is near the 45-degree line. Nevertheless, whenever we see most and sectors, whenever inflation is far away from the mean, we tend to see that the extensive margin contributes 1/4 of the increase in inflation, so the intensive margin is 3/4. Here you can see 7.5 relative to 10. So the main fact, this is going to be the metric of success in our model. We want to generate now a model that generates that whenever inflation goes to 10% above the mean, it generates an extensive margin of around 1/4. So let me go with the standard. This is an off-the-shelf menu cost model. So in the data, we have sectors. So in our model, we're going to have sector. There is going to be a continuum of ex-ante identical sectors. Each firms are going to be subject to sectoral productivity shocks, denoted by E, and Gaussian idiosyncratic quality shocks, denoted by U. Each firm is going to be hit by these shocks. We're going to have a Dixie-Stilling aggregator for sectoral goods output, where the elasticity of substitution is given by sigma. And we're going to have decreasing rate of the scale and only labor input for producing the intermediate input. The main idea is the following. Remember, strategic complementarity is going to be generated by decreasing rate of the scale. The main idea is the following. Remember, when you have decreasing rate of the scale, marginal cost is increasing in the amount that you sell. So why this will generate strategic complementarities? Let's assume we wake up and the price level goes up. If the price level goes up, then my relative price is lower, so I'm going to sell more because I have decreasing rate of the scale. Marginal cost now is going to be higher, and now I want to have a higher price. You can see that this is going to generate incentives to follow the price of the neighbor. Finally, we're not going to have fixed cost as a number. We're going to have random menu costs. And the main idea is when you see the distribution of price changes, it's highly dispersed. So one day you wake up and you have a small menu cost. One day you wake up and you have a big menu cost. And with this, we can generate dispersion of price changes. We're going to have consumers that discount the future array beta that are going to have quasi-linear preference on labor and cash in a buy constraint. The main idea is in this model, nominal wage is proportional to money supply. And the key is, if we don't have these assumptions, every firm needs to take into account the distribution of markup of all the sectors. But with this assumption, a firm problem in a sector is independent of other sectors. They're going to be independent. So now we need to parameterize the model, discounting first demand elasticity and span of control are standard. And we're going to choose the menu cost and the standard deviation of firm shocks to match UK micro price data. As you can see, we're going to target 4 moments: frequency, mean, standard deviation, and kurtosis of price changes. People have shown in the past that these moments are important. So here you can see the same graph that I define as the metric of success for my model with model and data. Okay, the blue line, the blue squares is the data. The black line is the 45-degree line. And the red dots are the model. As you can see, the model cannot reproduce the extensive margin at high inflation rate. It's always over the 45-degree line. Now, what is the case? Now, to understand why the extensive margin is so small, let me plot the distribution of desired price changes. What is the desired price changes? The log difference between my current price and my optimal price. The key thing that you can see here is the distribution of these price gaps, basically highly dispersed. It goes from -40% to 40%. What this is saying at the end of the day that we have significant menu cost for price adjustment, and many of the price changes are going to go because you have zero menu cost. So this model at the end of the day, when you put numbers, is close to Calvo. Mechanically, it generates a small responding frequency and therefore a small extensive margin. Now, how we are going to fix this problem? Basically, at the end of the day, what we need is take this graph. We need to generate the smallest spans while matching the dispersion of price changes. How we're going to do this? With a multi-product menu cost. So here we're going to follow Virgilio, Fernando, Francesco multi-product model. Now the key difference is that the firm is going to sell a continuous products for each product that is going to be a product quality shock, in addition to the sectoral specific shock, and there is going to be economies of scope in price adjustment. Basically, there is going to be a fixed number, menu cost 7, to change all prices. And we're going to add 2 ingredients. And a specific factor that is mobile across products on the firm, and a low elasticity of substitution between products of the firm. So what are the 2 differences that we're going to add? Different one, there is a Dixie style aggregator for what the firm produces, where the elasticity of substitution is not sigma, is gamma. And gamma is going to be smaller than sigma. Second, there is an extra factor of production that we call managerial input that is fixed at the firm level. And what is the main idea? Suppose that I'm selling a lot of a product, and because I'm selling a lot of a product, I have a high marginal cost. What the guy is going to do is to say, you know what, let's say managers. Because I'm selling more managers, I'm reducing the marginal cost, and I'm making within firm markup dispersion less costly. Now I'm going to parameterize the model. And notice the following. We're going to set gamma equal to 1, sigma the same as before, and we're going to choose this one parameter that is the menu cost to match the frequency, the mean, the standard deviation. We're not going to target kurtosis of price changes. We're going to simulate this economy, recover the extensive margin of sectoral inflation, and now we see that the model reproduces the extensive margin of sectoral inflation for large deviation of inflation relative to the mean. Now, why is this the case? Because now the model needs smallest bands, and whenever the average price of the firm hit this smallest bands, the firm will change all the prices within the firm. So we can have the elasticity of the frequency of price change closer to the data. No, whatever, exactly as the data. Okay, now I want to use this model to understand what will happen whenever we have a monetary shock, whenever the money shock is small and large. So we're going to do an MIT shock for money supply. Remember, in this model, money supply will go to prices or quantities, and how prices are sticky will affect how much will go to prices or quantities. For small money shocks, our model is exactly identical to the single product model. Nevertheless, when we have big shocks, our model predicts different dynamic of output relative to the single product. The main reason why you have this result is because the size of the SS bands does not affect the IRF for a small shock, but it does affect for large shocks. So here I'm putting in the x-axis different sizes of shocks, in the y-axis the output response on impact. As you can see, the single product is linear for the relevant domain. Nevertheless, for our model, it's going to be non-linear. Why? Because the frequency starts to react following 5% monetary shock. Now, remember, Philip Core is output, the relation between output and inflation. So here I'm plotting the output response on impact follow different sizes of money shock with inflation. What do you see? For a small money shocks and therefore small output gaps, the single product Philip Core is the same as the multi-product, but whenever you go and you start adding bigger and bigger shocks, more of the shocks are going to go to inflation instead of output gap. Okay, what did I do? I show you how to go, take a standard menu cost model, put some stuff in order to generate the movement between inflation and frequency. And the whole idea is you want the firm to choose optimally smallest bands for the firm average markup. Now the model can match micropath statistics and also the response of the frequency, and therefore we're going to have no linearities. That's all.
Thank you very much, Andres. Now we are in the Q&A space. Andres or Zheng, do you have any questions for each other? Perhaps we can start by that.
So
If not,
Andres,
yeah.
it's a very nice paper. I enjoyed. It's a I just want to mention a couple things. One is to what extent the results depend on low elasticity of substitution within firm between products, because that example you gave in the beginning about Starbucks, I wasn't sure if I can connect to your model. If you go in and you want a cappuccino or you want a latte, those are like some people really prefer one thing over the other. It's like a complete substitutes. I'm not going to get both. So that's one maybe minor thing to motivate the assumption. The other thing is there's a recent paper by Narayana Kocherlakota I just saw last week in Montreal conference. He's saying there's he can get a nonlinear Phillips curve in a time-dependent price like a Calvo model, because there's a substitution. When there's a high inflation, people substitute toward the products that has sticky prices because those relative prices lower. So when inflation is high, then the inflation response is smaller because of the substitution. There's a concave Phillips curve. It's maybe a complementary story to yours.
Okay, let's go first with the calibration of gamma. What we did in the paper is to make robustness and say, okay, let's assume that gamma is going to be 1, 2, or 3, and for sure the result depends on gamma. In some sense, you need to make incentive for the firm to change the price whenever the average markup within the firm is far away from the optimum. Now, we did in this way. We're not saying it's the only way. There could be many other ways. Again, at the end of the day, it's an empirical question. Is okay. Forget about like simple examples. Can you show systematic evidence of different demand elasticity across within firm or across firm? Again, I believe this is the next step. We didn't do it in this project. And then Narayana is a smart guy. So I have no idea about that paper. So I will read it and I will let you know. I have a question about your project. It is true that age is exogenous because we didn't decide when to leave. But in some sense, there could be many confounding factors that could correlate with age. You went with asset, but there could be other. Have you ever thought about other mechanisms that could correlate with age?
Well, the data that we have is just like Stefan Nagel shared with us. What it has is age cohort specific inflation expectations. So it's like from age 20 and so on to 55. I'm not sure about the exact range, but for each age group, there's an expectation. So their argument is that experience-based expectation is more like or less subject to endogeneity concerns. I don't think there's anything that's pure. Maybe we can also try to see if this age cohort specific expectation can be predicted or depend on some demographic factors. We could run a first stage regression and take the residual on the demographic stuff. I'm not sure. We haven't checked that.
Okay. Actually, I have a question for Zheng, if that's okay. Higher moments like interquartile range or skewness or kurtosis are correlated with the business cycle. If you look at the data for inflation expectations, you will find that that variance is usually counter-cyclical, but skewness and kurtosis in inflation expectations are pro-cyclical. So I was wondering whether you control for the business cycle when you do your regressions, because we know that monetary policy effects are state dependent when evaluated in this framework.
In the baseline, we use just the Michigan survey IQR skewness, and we added the control for aggregate variables like consumption, unemployment, inflation, Fed funds rate. So that's exactly addressing your concern about the business cycle co-movement. And we also did a bunch of other controls. I didn't have time to go through inflation, median inflation expectation, and its interaction with monetary policy, inflation uncertainty and interaction, and income growth expectation, income uncertainty, and a lot of stuff in the control. So the results are quite robust.
And another question for you, Cenk. When you run the state level regressions, there might be unobserved heterogeneity in demands and marginal costs across states. And that could affect the estimated coefficients. Have you tried a two-step regression? First of dependent variable of monetary policy shock, and then estimated coefficients on the IQR, so there is no potential contamination. And then a follow-up question from Rafael is that is there still an interaction of monetary policy with expectation IQR when you take into account IQR of actual inflation rates?
Yeah, for the first question, we haven't done the two-step regression, although we control for state fixed effect and time fixed effect in that regression, the state level regression. Maybe there are other unobserved heterogeneity that varies both across states and across time. That we haven't controlled. I have to think about what variables to include for that regression because the data is kind of limited. We could throw in I'm not sure, throw in a lagged dependent variable, maybe state level unemployment, for example, to partly mitigate that concern. For the second question, I'm not sure what, Rafael, you mean by taking into account IQR of actual inflation. You mean IQR across states, or what is the?
I meant there's dispersion in the prices that's also time varying, and the question is where the expectations, is it the expectations or is it the dispersion in the underlying prices? But I think that we may have, there's that's sort of the question. What is really the exact is an expectational mechanism versus sort of like something else, and then the dispersion.
I see. Yeah. So that's in the baseline model, as I just mentioned to Damian, we control for individuals' inflation uncertainty. That's still expectation. So yeah, I have to think a little bit about how to control for this dispersion in the price. We can talk offline if you want. Yeah.
And for Andres, it looks like that for a very large shock, the absolute change in price decreased. Can you explain what force was causing that?
Okay, remember the following: when you have this CES technology, the profit function is asymmetric. So no firm would like to set the price lower than marginal cost or markup less than 1. So what happens is whatever decrease markup is going to generate a big increase in frequency relative to decrease of markups. If you decrease markup, this generates a big increase in frequency relative to the increase in markups. So why does the single product firm matches the left? So in the figure where I was showing the desired price, I was showing the hazard rate. So both models, the single product and the multi-product, match the same micro price statistics. One more time. These two models generate the same dispersion of price changes. how sensitive are your results to the low elasticity of asset? Look, we went with these two assumptions. I don't know, we thought it was reasonable. At the end of the day, what you need in a multi-product model is to generate incentive for the firm to tolerate within firm dispersion of markups, and therefore choosing a smallest bands for average prices. Again, we went with this. There could be other like ways to generate the same. Do you have any evidence? So there is a question about misallocation with the firm. Again, I don't have evidence, but there is some evidence by Vincent and Matthias of capital dispersion within between establishment and for the firm and between establishment. And they have, I believe, like 3/4 of capital dispersion in general is between establishment. Again, it's no product, it's whatever we have. Okay, Dominic, it looked like for very large shocks, the absolute.
We already answered this question. I think we have to finish up at this stage. Thank you very much for all the presentations, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.